Before I tell you what happened that night, I need you to think about something very carefully. Have you ever heard a sound that didn't feel like it belonged where you were? Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. The kind of sound that makes you stop for a second, look around, and wonder if anyone else noticed it too. And when no one reacts, you start asking yourself a different question. Did I really hear that? Or was it just me? Most people ignore those moments. They brush them off, blame it on stress, lack of sleep, or their imagination trying to fill in the silence. But what if I told you that sometimes you're not imagining anything at all? My name is Daniel Reeves, and for the last 9 years, I've been working as a night maintenance supervisor for a small regional airport in southern Arizona. It's not the kind of place you see in movies. No massive terminals, no endless crowds, just 2 runways, a handful of gates, and long stretches of quiet desert surrounding everything. At night, it gets even quieter. Most flights are done by midnight. After that, it's just cargo planes, occasional private jets, and people like me making sure nothing breaks until morning. You learn a lot working nights. You learn how different the world feels when most people are asleep. You learn how silence isn't really silent. And if you stay long enough, you start noticing things that don't fit. At first, it was small, things you could easily ignore. A door that should have been locked, slightly open. Lights flickering in areas where power systems were recently checked. Equipment turning on by itself, then shutting off like nothing happened. Normal explanations always existed. Loose wiring, old infrastructure, human error. That's what I told myself every time. That's what I told my team. Because once you stop believing in simple explanations, everything becomes harder to deal with. It stayed like that for months. Nothing serious. Just enough to notice, not enough to report. Until the radio started. It began on a Thursday night. I remember that clearly because Thursdays were always the slowest shifts. Fewer flights, fewer staff, less noise. Just long hours and routine checks. I was in the maintenance office going through a checklist when I heard it. A voice, faint, coming through the handheld radio sitting on the desk. At first, I thought someone had accidentally keyed their mic. It happens all the time. But something about it made me stop what I was doing. Not because of what it said, because of how it sounded. The voice was steady. Too steady. No background noise, no breathing, no distortion from distance, just a perfectly clean signal. That shouldn't have been possible. Our radios weren't that clear even in ideal conditions. I picked it up slowly, listening more carefully, continuing scheduled transmission, monitoring active, awaiting confirmation. The words were simple, but the way they were delivered, it didn't sound like a person talking. It sounded like something reading, like it understood the words, but didn't understand what they meant. I pressed the talk button. Maintenance to all units. Who's on this channel? No response, just silence. Then a burst of static. Then the voice again. Same tone, same pace. Continuing scheduled transmission. I felt a slight tension in my chest, not fear, just discomfort. The kind you get when something doesn't line up with what you expect. I switched channels. Nothing. Switched again. Clear. Back to the original channel. The voice was gone. Just normal radio silence. I stood there for a moment waiting. Nothing else came through. After about a minute, I set the radio back down and went back to my checklist. Interference, I muttered to myself. Probably from a nearby tower or overlapping frequency. That made sense. It had to. But even as I said it, I knew something didn't feel right. About an hour later, I was doing a routine inspection near Hangar B. That side of the airport was always darker. Fewer lights, less activity. It felt removed from everything else. I had just finished checking one of the electrical panels when my radio clicked again. Louder this time. Clearer. Primary channel stable. Signal integrity confirmed. I froze. That same voice. Same tone. Same unnatural calm. Same unnatural calm. I slowly reached for the radio clipped to my belt. For a second, I considered ignoring it, pretending I didn't hear it. But I couldn't. "Who is transmitting?" I asked. No answer. The voice continued. Environment unchanged. No deviation detected. I looked around. The hangar was empty. No vehicles. No workers. Just rows of equipment and shadows stretching across the concrete floor. "Control, do you copy?" I said, switching channels. The control tower responded immediately. "Go ahead, Daniel." Normal voice. Normal static. Everything sounded exactly the way it should. "You getting any interference on channel 3? A pause. Then, negative. Channels clear. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the radio. "Yeah, all right." I switched back, silence, again, like nothing had happened. I stood there longer than I should have, listening, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. That should have been the end of it. Just another strange moment I could explain away later. But it wasn't. Because later that night, something changed. I was walking back toward the maintenance office when I passed one of the security monitors. We had cameras covering most parts of the airport. Runways, hangars, storage areas, standard stuff. I wasn't even paying attention at first, just walking past. Then something in the corner of my eye made me stop. One of the screens. The feed was from Hangar B. The same place I had just been. At first glance, everything looked normal. Empty. Still. But then I noticed something. The camera angle. It wasn't right. It was slightly off. Like it had been adjusted. But we didn't have remote-controlled cameras. They were fixed. Manually installed. I stepped closer. And that's when I saw it. For just a second. A flicker. Not like a glitch. Not static. Movement. At the far end of the hangar. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. Nothing. Empty again. I let out a slow breath. "Get it together," I said quietly. "Probably just a delay in the feed, or my eyes playing tricks." But as I turned to walk away, the radio on my belt came to life again. Right next to my ear. Loud enough to make me flinch. Observer present. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked. Visual confirmation achieved. My heart started beating faster now. Not panic, not yet, but something close. I slowly turned back toward the monitor. The screen was still, empty, but the voice continued. Subject unaware. I swallowed. "Who is this?" I said, my voice lower now. No response to me, just the same calm delivery. Monitoring continues. And then silence. Complete. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just interference. Just equipment malfunction. Just coincidence. But deep down, I already knew something had changed. Because that voice wasn't just broadcasting anymore. It was describing, and the worst part was, it wasn't wrong. I didn't report it. That's the first mistake people always expect you to admit later, like it would have changed everything if you had just said something sooner. But the truth is, when something doesn't make sense, your brain works overtime to make it smaller, not bigger. You don't want it to become real. You want it to shrink back into something manageable. Something explainable. That's what I told myself as I walked away from that monitor. Interference. Cross signal. Maybe even someone messing with frequencies for a joke. Airports get weird sometimes, especially at night. You hear things, see things that don't line up. And most of the time, they fade once you stop paying attention. So I stopped paying attention. At least, I tried to. I went back to the maintenance office and sat down, forcing myself to focus on paperwork. Routine tasks. Numbers. Checklists. Things that didn't leave room for imagination. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. No voice. No strange signals. Just the normal hum of the building and the faint sound of distant aircraft moving somewhere out on the runway. I almost convinced myself it was over. Then the lights flickered. Not just once. 3 times in a row. Quick. Controlled. Like a pattern. I looked up immediately. The overhead lights stabilized, glowing the same dull white they always did. The computer screen stayed on. No power loss, no system reset. Everything went normal, but something about the flicker felt deliberate. I checked the panel beside the door. All systems stable. No alerts. No fluctuations. That didn't make sense. If there had been a surge, it would have shown up somewhere. I stood there for a moment, staring at the panel, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. So I sat back down. That's when I noticed the radio. It wasn't on the desk anymore. It was still where I had left it, but the position had changed slightly, just enough to catch my attention. I didn't remember touching it, not after the last transmission. I leaned forward slowly, studying it. Same device, same channel, nothing visibly different. But I felt that same quiet tension again. The kind that doesn't come from what you see, but from what you can't explain. I reached out and picked it up. The moment my hand closed around it, it activated. No click, no static burst, just instant transmission. Observer re-engaged. My fingers tightened slightly. The voice was clearer now, not louder, sharper, like whatever was transmitting had adjusted something. "Identify yourself," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. No response. At least, not to me. Response pattern noted. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. That wasn't interference. That was reaction. It wasn't just broadcasting anymore. It was tracking. I switched channels again. Control. "You hearing anything unusual?" I asked. "Negative," the operator replied. "Everything's clean." "Any unauthorized transmissions?" "None." I paused for a second, debating whether to push further. Then I stopped. Because I already knew what they were going to say. There was nothing on their end. Whatever this was, it wasn't affecting the system the way it should. I switched back. Silence. Again. Like it had never happened. I set the radio down slowly, this time making sure I placed it exactly where I could see it clearly. Then I leaned back in my chair and just watched. Minutes passed. Nothing changed. The lights stayed steady. No movement. No sound. And slowly that tension started to fade again. That's how it works. It pulls back just enough to make you question it. To make you doubt yourself. To make you think maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it really was nothing. I almost believed it. Until I heard the door. Not opening. Not closing, just shifting. A slight movement of metal against metal. I turned my head slowly toward it. The office door was closed, exactly the way I left it. But the handle was turning. Very slowly. No one was on the other side. I knew that before I even stood up. Because there were no footsteps. No shadows under the door. Nothing. Just the handle moving on its own. I stood up anyway. Slowly. Every step felt heavier than it should have. The handle stopped moving the moment I got close. Just stopped. Like it had never been touched. I reached out and grabbed it. Cold. Completely still. I pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. Lights on. No movement. No sound. Just a long stretch of corridor leading toward the hangars. I stepped out, looking both directions. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed slightly, then faded. No answer. I stood there for a few seconds longer, waiting. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. That's when the radio spoke again. Right behind me. "Proximity test complete." I turned so fast I almost knocked the chair over. The radio was still on the desk. exactly where I had placed it. I hadn't touched it. Subject response consistent. My heart was beating faster now. Not controlled anymore. Not steady. This wasn't background noise. This wasn't interference. This was interaction. "You're not on any system," I said, my voice tight now. "So what are you?" The voice didn't answer. It never answered questions. It only observed. Verbal engagement logged. I stared at it, waiting, hoping it would stop, hoping it wouldn't continue, both at the same time. Adaptation in progress. That was new. I felt that one more than I heard it. Something about those words landed differently. Adaptation. To what? To me? I took a step back from the desk, then another, putting space between myself and the radio, like distance would change anything. It didn't. Distance irrelevant. I froze. That wasn't coincidence, that was direct. That was the first time it had responded to something I did immediately. My breathing slowed, not because I was calm, but because I was trying to think. Trying to understand. It wasn't just listening, it was learning. Every reaction, every word, every movement, and adjusting. That realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant this wasn't static. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't even just a signal. It was something else entirely. Something active, something aware. I stared at the radio for a long time. Then slowly, I reached out and turned it off. The screen went dark. The room fell completely silent. No voice, no hum, nothing. For a moment, relief washed over me. Simple, immediate, like cutting power had ended it. But then I noticed something. The silence wasn't normal. It felt too clean, too complete, like something was missing from it. And then, without any sound, without any signal, without the radio even being on, I heard it again. Not in the room, not through the device, but somewhere else, somewhere closer. Somewhere closer. Connection established. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe properly for a second. Because that voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. And for the first time that night, I realized something that made everything else worse. It didn't need the radio at all. Please write next part, but make sure each part's length should be of 1,200 to 1,300 words. Got it. Continuing with the same tone, pacing, and immersion. Here is part 3, 1,200 to 1,300 words. Continuous, standalone, more engaging. The moment I realized the voice didn't need the radio anymore, something inside me shifted from confusion to something colder. Not panic. Panic comes fast and loud. This was slower, heavier. The kind of understanding that settles in and doesn't leave. I didn't move at first. I just stood there in the middle of the office, staring at the dead radio on the desk, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. People hear things sometimes. Stress does that. Lack of sleep, long shifts, isolation. It all builds up. That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. Then it spoke again. Baseline awareness increasing. This time it wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It felt close. Not like a sound traveling through air, more like something forming directly in the space where sound usually ends up. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing had changed. Same walls, same lights, same empty corners. But the feeling was different, like the room itself had become part of something I couldn't see. "Okay," I said under my breath, forcing myself to stay grounded. "Think. If it wasn't the radio, then what? Speakers? Hidden transmitters? Some kind of internal system malfunction? None of that explained the clarity, or the timing, or how it knew what I was doing. Analysis initiated. I clenched my jaw. "Stop," I said, louder now. Just stop. Silence. Yelled her, now. Just stop. Silence. For a second, I thought it had worked. Then, command structure noted, ineffective. My stomach tightened. That wasn't random. That was a response. And not just a response, a conclusion. I backed away from the desk slowly, putting more space between myself and everything in that room. Because it didn't matter where the sound was coming from anymore. The problem wasn't the source. It was the connection. That word hit me without warning. Connection. I hadn't thought it before, not clearly. But now it felt obvious. Something had connected. And I didn't know how. I moved toward the door again, slower this time, more aware of every step, every sound, every small shift in the environment. When I reached the handle, I hesitated, not because I thought something would grab me, but because I wasn't sure leaving the room would change anything. Movement anticipated. I stopped. That was immediate. Too immediate. I hadn't even opened the door yet. "You don't know that," I said. Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. It did know. Or at least, it was predicting. I pulled the door open anyway. The hallway looked exactly the same as before. Long, empty, quiet. But now that quiet felt different. Before, it was just absence of sound. Now, it felt like space waiting to be filled. I stepped out. Nothing happened. No sudden change. No new voice. Just the same still corridor. I let out a slow breath. Maybe distance still mattered. Maybe I was overthinking it. I started walking. Each step echoed slightly, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that felt sharper than usual. Too clean. Too precise. I reached the corner that led toward Hangar B and stopped. I didn't want to go back there, not after what I saw on the monitor, not after what I heard. But something pulled at me, not physically, not like a force, more like a direction. Like part of me already knew where this was leading. Path selection confirmed. I closed my eyes for a second, just a second, trying to shut it out, trying to reset. When I opened them again, nothing had changed, except the fact that I knew I was going to keep walking. I turned the corner. The lights flickered again. Same pattern. 3 quick pulses. Then steady. My steps slowed. Every instinct was telling me to turn back, to leave, to report it, to get someone else involved. But another part of me, a quieter part, was still trying to understand, trying to see where this went. And that part kept me moving. Hangar B came into view. The large doors were closed. Everything looked normal, exactly the way it should. But I knew better now. Normal didn't mean anything anymore. I stepped closer. The air felt different here, not colder, not warmer, just heavier. Like the space held something invisible. Environmental consistency maintained. I swallowed. "You keep saying things like that," I muttered. "What does it even mean?" No answer. Of course not. It never explained. It only stated. I reached the side door of the hangar and placed my hand on it. Cold metal. Solid. Real. I pulled it open. The inside was dark. Not completely. Just dim enough that the far end faded into shadow. I stepped in slowly. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Then everything went quiet. No wind, no distant noise, nothing, just that same stillness. I took another step, then another. And that's when I noticed it. The sound. Not the voice, something else. Low, steady, almost like a hum, but deeper, too deep to hear clearly. More like something you feel than something you detect. I stopped walking. The hum didn't. It stayed constant, like it wasn't reacting, like it had always been there. I turned slightly, looking around the hangar. Still empty, still nothing. But that feeling, that pressure, it was coming from somewhere. Signal alignment progressing, my chest tightened. That word again. Signal. This wasn't just observation anymore. This was process. I took a step back. The hum didn't change, didn't follow, didn't react. It just remained. I turned toward the exit. That was it. I had seen enough, heard enough. This wasn't something I could handle alone. I needed to leave, now. I took 3 steps toward the door. Then the voice came again, closer than before. Withdrawal detected. I froze. Adjustment required. The hum changed. Not louder, not faster. Different, like something had shifted its frequency. And for the first time, it hurt, not sharp pain. Not enough to drop me, but enough to make me stop moving. Enough to make my head feel heavy. Like pressure building behind my eyes. I reached up, pressing my fingers against my temple. "What are you doing?" I said through clenched teeth. No answer, just that same steady tone. Stabilization in progress. I staggered slightly, catching myself before I lost balance. My vision blurred for a second, then snapped back. The pressure eased. Just like that. Gone. I stood there, breathing harder now, my heart racing in a way I couldn't control anymore. That wasn't random. That wasn't interference. That was direct. It didn't want me to leave. Not yet. And that realization settled in with a weight I couldn't ignore. Because if it could stop me from walking away, then this wasn't just observation anymore. It was control. I looked around the hangar again, slower this time, more careful, trying to see something I had missed, trying to understand what I was standing inside. And then I noticed it. At the far end, near the back wall, something was different. Not movement, not a figure, just absence, like a section of space that didn't reflect light the same way as everything else. I squinted, taking a step forward. The hum shifted slightly, not reacting, guiding, focus directed. My throat tightened. That wasn't subtle anymore. It was leading me, and for some reason, I followed. I don't know why I kept walking. That's the part I've gone over more than anything else since that night. Not the voice, not the hum, not even what I eventually saw. But that decision, that moment where every instinct I had was telling me to turn around, to get out, to call someone, to do anything except what I actually did, and I ignored all of it. Step by step, I moved deeper into the hangar, toward that section of space that didn't look right. It wasn't obvious at first. If you glanced at it, you'd miss it completely. But the longer you stared, the clearer it became. The light didn't behave normally there. It didn't reflect off the surface behind it the same way it did everywhere else. It wasn't darker, not exactly. It just felt absent, like something was there, but not in a way your eyes were meant to understand. Visual focus increasing. The voice was steady, calm, watching. I slowed my pace, my boots echoing faintly across the concrete floor. Each step felt louder than it should have, like the sound wasn't just bouncing around the hangar but being noticed. That thought hit me hard enough to make me hesitate. Not just heard, not just detected, noticed. I swallowed and kept going, because stopping didn't feel like an option anymore. The closer I got, the stronger that low hum became, not in volume, but in presence. It settled deeper into my body, like something vibrating just beneath the surface of everything. It made my chest feel tight, my breathing slightly uneven, but I didn't stop. At about 20 feet away, I finally paused, not because I wanted to, because my body did. It was like something in me refused to take another step without understanding what I was looking at. and for the first time I really looked. The space in front of me wasn't empty. It just wasn't solid in the way everything else was. It shifted, subtly, not moving from one place to another, but changing within itself, like layers sliding over each other without ever separating. I leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better angle. It didn't help. If anything, it made it worse, because the more I tried to focus on it, the less defined it became. Visual processing limited. My jaw tightened. "Yeah," I muttered. "No kidding." I took another step forward. This time, the hum reacted. It deepened. Not louder. Deeper. Like it had more weight behind it now. And the pressure in my head returned. Faster than before. Stronger. I winced slightly, raising a hand to my temple again. "All right," I said through my teeth. "That's enough." I took a step back. The pressure eased immediately. The hum softened. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to piece together what had just happened. It wasn't random. It was tied to distance. Proximity mattered. The closer I got, the stronger the effect. Distance correlation confirmed. I let out a short, humorless breath. "Of course you confirm it," I said. "You already knew. But that gave me something. A rule. A boundary. And that meant I wasn't completely out of control here." I stepped forward again, slowly. The pressure returned, not as sharp this time, more controlled, like it was adjusting, matching me. Adaptation continuing. That word again. Adaptation, not just reacting. Learning. Refining. I stopped just short of where the pressure became uncomfortable. Holding that position, testing it. The hum stabilized. The shifting space in front of me became clearer. Not visually, but perceptually, like my brain was starting to process it differently. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a pattern, not a shape. Not something you could draw or define, but movement that wasn't random, repeating, cycling, like whatever I was looking at followed its own internal logic. I leaned in slightly, careful not to push too far, trying to track it. Pattern recognition engaged. My breathing slowed, not because I was calm, because I was focused. The movement inside that space wasn't chaotic. It had rhythm, structure. And the more I watched, the more it started to feel familiar. That's what scared me. Because I didn't know why, or how. But something about it made sense, in a way I couldn't explain. I blinked hard, pulling my gaze away. "No," I said quietly. "That's not right." The moment I broke focus, the clarity disappeared. The space returned to that indistinct, shifting state, and the hum softened again. I took a step back, then another. Putting distance between myself and whatever that was, the pressure faded completely. My breathing steadied. And for a second, I felt like I had control again. That's when the voice changed. Not the tone, not the volume, the structure. Initial alignment successful. I froze. That wasn't the same kind of observation as before. That was progress. Progress toward what? I didn't ask. I didn't want to, because I had a feeling I already knew the answer, and I wasn't ready to hear it. I turned toward the exit again. This time, the hum didn't react. The pressure didn't return. The space behind me didn't change. It just stayed, like it didn't need to stop me anymore. That was worse, because it meant it wasn't trying to keep me there. It had already gotten what it needed. I walked faster this time. Not running, not panicking, but definitely not staying. Each step toward the door felt easier than the last. Lighter, like something had been released. Or maybe transferred. That thought hit me just as I reached the exit. My hand hovered over the door handle, and for a second, I hesitated, because something felt different, not around me, in me, subtle, but there, like a faint echo of that hum, not external, internal, baseline updated. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, trying to isolate it. The sensation sharpened slightly. There, under everything, faint, but real. I opened my eyes immediately, my hand tightening on the handle. "No," I said, "that's not staying." I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway. The moment I did, it dropped. The sensation faded. The hum disappeared completely, like it had never been there. I stood there for a second, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that was the end of it, that leaving had worked, that distance still mattered. Then I realized something. The voice hadn't spoken. Not since I turned away. Not since I started leaving. That silence felt intentional, like it didn't need to say anything anymore. I walked back toward the maintenance office quickly now, not running, but close. Every step felt like I was putting distance between myself and something I didn't fully understand. When I reached the office, I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The room looked exactly the same as before. The radio still sat on the desk, powered off, unchanged. I leaned against the wall for a second, letting my breathing settle. "Okay," I said quietly. "You're out. That's it." I pushed myself off the wall and walked toward the desk. Everything felt normal again. Too normal. I reached for the radio. Just to check. Just to confirm. My hand hovered over it. Then, without touching it, without any sound, without any signal, I heard it again. Clear. Closer than ever. Carryover confirmed. My entire body went still. Because this time, I didn't just hear it. I understood what it meant. It wasn't in the hangar anymore, and it wasn't in the radio. It was with me. Please write next part, but make sure each part's length should be of 1,200 to 1,300 words. Got it. Continuing with the same immersive style, escalation, and psychological depth. Here is part 5, 1,200 to 1,300 words. Continuous, standalone, highly engaging. Heh. The moment I understood that it was with me, not in the hangar, not in the radio, not tied to any physical thing I could walk away from, something in my mind stopped trying to rationalize it. Up until then, I had been searching for explanations, for systems I could recognize, for anything that would fit into the way I understood the world. But that thought "it's with me" cut through all of that. It didn't leave room for easy answers. I didn't move. My hand was still hovering over the radio on the desk, fingers slightly curled, like I had been about to pick it up. But now that didn't matter anymore. The radio wasn't the source. It never really had been. Integration stable. The voice didn't feel like it was coming from anywhere. It didn't echo. It didn't carry. It just existed, right there in the same space as my thoughts. I pulled my hand back slowly, like touching anything might make it worse. My chest felt tight, not from panic, but from something heavier. Awareness. The kind that doesn't spike and fade, but settles in and stays. "No," I said quietly. "That's not possible." Silence. Then, denial pattern identified. I closed my eyes, not to escape, to focus. Because if it wasn't external anymore, then I needed to figure out where it was, inside my head. That was the first thought, but it didn't feel like that either. It didn't feel like imagination. It didn't feel like memory. It felt separate, present, but not originating from me. I opened my eyes again and stepped back from the desk. "All right," I said under my breath. "If you're here, then answer something." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Objective continuation. My jaw tightened. Continuation of what? Process. That word hit differently now, because I had already seen part of that process. In the hangar, with the pattern, the alignment, the pressure. You already did something back there, I said. So what's next? There was a longer pause this time. Not silence, not absence, just delay. Like it was considering something. Then, progression dependent on subject. I exhaled slowly. So it depends on me. Confirmation that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made it worse. Because that meant I wasn't just dealing with something happening to me. I was part of it, actively. Whether I wanted to be or not. I turned away from the desk and started pacing slowly across the room. I needed to think, but thinking wasn't the same anymore. Every thought felt sharper, more direct, like there was less space between questions and conclusions, and that clarity, that was new. I stopped walking. That wasn't just stress. That wasn't adrenaline. That was change, subtle, but real. Cognitive shift observed. I laughed once. Short, dry. Yeah, I said. I noticed. I ran a hand over my face, trying to ground myself in something familiar. This process, I said, lowering my hand. What is it actually doing? Another pause. Then alignment. That word again. Alignment. That word again. Alignment. I looked down at my hands, flexing my fingers slowly. Nothing looked different. Nothing felt physically different. But internally, something had shifted. How much alignment? I asked. Initial phase complete. My stomach tightened. Initial? That meant there were more. More phases. More steps. How many phases? I asked. Silence. Then, not quantifiable within current framework, I frowned. That doesn't answer the question. Imitation acknowledged. I let out a slow breath. Convenient. I stopped pacing and leaned against the desk, staring at the floor, trying to piece this together. If it wasn't forcing anything, if it wasn't taking control, then what was it actually doing? Adapting. Aligning. Integrating. All those words pointed the same thing. Change. Gradual. Incremental. And tied directly to interaction. I straightened slightly. Okay, I said. So if I don't engage, what happens? There was no delay this time. Process slows, stops, no. I felt that weight settle deeper in my chest. So it continues anyway. Reduced rate, that was worse than stopping. Because it meant there was no clean exit. No simple way to end it. Only ways to slow it down. I pushed off the desk and walked toward the door again. Not rushing. Just moving. Testing something. As I reached the handle, I paused. What if I leave? I asked. Location relevant, I nodded slightly. Yeah, I figured. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. Everything looked normal. Same lights. Same empty space. Same quiet. But now that quiet felt thinner. Like there was something underneath it. Something I couldn't hear directly, but could still sense. I walked slowly down the corridor, my steps steady, my breathing controlled, trying to see if distance changed anything. Baseline stable. It didn't. Not really. The presence stayed the same, not stronger, not weaker, just there, consistent. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped. All right, I said quietly, then let's test something else. I closed my eyes again, but this time I didn't try to block it out. I focused on it, directly. The response was immediate. The presence sharpened. The clarity increased, and that faint echo of the hum returned. Not loud, but noticeable. Engagement detected. I kept my focus steady. Didn't pull away. Didn't react. Just held it. The sensation deepened slightly. Not uncomfortable. just more defined, like tuning into something. Signal strengthening. I opened my eyes slowly. The hallway looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Edges seemed sharper, distances clearer, like everything had more structure to it. I exhaled slowly, so focusing on it makes it stronger, accurate, and ignoring it slows it down. 9 partial, I nodded once. That gave me another rule, another boundary. But it also confirmed something else. This wasn't just passive, it required participation. At some level. I leaned back against the wall, staring down the hallway. What happens if I fully engage? I asked. This time, there was a longer pause, longer than any before. Outcome beyond current tolerance threshold. I frowned. Meaning. Subject not yet prepared. That word stuck. Prepared. For what? I asked. Silence. No response. Not even a delayed one. Just nothing. I pushed off the wall again. Yeah, I said quietly. That's what I thought. I started walking back toward the office, slow, measured. Because now I understood something important. This wasn't just something happening in the moment. This was building towards something. And whatever that was, I wasn't there yet. But I was moving toward it, step by step, whether I wanted to or not. As I reached the office door again, I stopped for a second. One last question. Can you stop? I asked. No hesitation. No, I closed my eyes briefly. Not surprised, just confirming. When I opened them again, everything looked exactly the same as it had before this all started. Same hallway, same lights, same building. But none of it felt the same anymore. Because now I knew something I couldn't unknow. It wasn't about the place, or the radio, or even the hangar. It was about me. And whatever this was, it wasn't leaving. It wasn't ending. It was continuing. And the only thing I could control now was how fast it moved. By that point, I stopped trying to treat it like a problem I could solve in one moment. That was my first mistake earlier, thinking there would be a single explanation, a single fix, something I could point to and say, this is what's wrong. But now it was clear that whatever this was, it didn't work like that. It wasn't an event. It wasn't even a situation. It was a process, and I was already inside it. The only thing left was to understand it. Not completely, that didn't feel possible anymore, but enough to know where I stood. I went back into the office and closed the door behind me again. Slower this time, more deliberate. The room looked exactly the same, but I didn't trust that anymore. Appearances didn't mean anything now. What mattered was what I could feel, what I could sense underneath everything else. I walked over to the desk and sat down, placing both hands flat on the surface. All right, I said quietly. If this is going to continue, then I need to know what changes. No response. That didn't surprise me. It never volunteered anything. It only responded when I reached the right point, so I adjusted the question. What has already changed? A pause. Then, baseline perception altered. I exhaled slowly. Be specific. Sensory prioritization adjusted. Pattern recognition increased. Response latency reduced. I nodded slightly. That matched what I had been feeling. Things were sharper, faster, more connected. And that's just the beginning, I asked. Initial phase. There it was again. Initial. Everything pointed back to that. How many phases are there? I asked. Silence. Then, progression not linear. I frowned. That's not an answer. Framework insufficient. I leaned back in the chair, running a hand across my forehead. All right, I muttered. Then we simplify. If it wasn't linear, then it wasn't steps, not in the way I understood them. More like states. Levels of alignment. How far am I from the end? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, distance undefined. I let out a quiet breath. Yeah, I figured. I stood up again, restless, unable to sit still with all of this building in my head. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but in a way I couldn't fully explain. Like my awareness had expanded beyond it, making the space feel limited. I walked to the far wall and leaned against it. Okay, I said, then let's test something else. I closed my eyes again, but this time, I didn't just focus. I leaned into it. Not fully, not completely, but more than before. The response was immediate, stronger, clearer. The presence sharpened, the faint hum returning with more definition, more structure. It didn't feel external anymore. It felt like something I could reach without moving. Engagement increased, my breathing slowed, not intentionally. It just happened, like my body was adjusting without me telling it to. The clarity followed. Everything felt more aligned. Thoughts moved faster, but not in a chaotic way. In a straight line. Direct. Efficient. And for a moment, it felt right. That's what made it dangerous. Because it didn't feel like something was wrong. It felt like something was working better. I opened my eyes. The room snapped back into place. But that clarity didn't disappear completely. It lingered. Stronger than before. I pushed off the wall slowly. That's the effect, I said. That's what it's doing. Confirmation. I nodded. So the more I engage, the more that becomes permanent. Integration increases. I stopped walking. Integration. Not temporary. Not reversible. Permanent. How much of that is already integrated? I asked. The pause this time felt heavier. Then, threshold approaching. My chest tightened slightly. Approaching what? Silence. No answer. I clenched my jaw. You keep doing that, I said. You give part of it, then stop. Information pacing required. I let out a short breath. Required for who? Subject. That hit differently. Because it meant this wasn't just about what it could do. It was about what I could handle. I walked back to the desk and rested my hands on it again, leaning forward slightly. So if I go too fast, instability risk. I nodded, meaning damage. Interpretation acceptable. I stayed quiet for a moment, letting that settle, because that changed things. This wasn't just progression. It had limits, boundaries, not fixed ones, but adaptive, based on me. That meant I wasn't completely powerless, but it also meant something else. I was the constraint. I straightened slowly. So the process isn't limited, I said. I am. Accurate. I closed my eyes briefly. Not to focus, just to think. Because that meant something important. This wasn't building toward something fixed. It was building as far as I could go. And that raised a question I hadn't asked yet. What happens if I reach that limit? I said. No hesitation this time. Transition. I opened my eyes. Transition to what? Silence. Again, I shook my head slightly. Yeah, not getting that answer either. I stepped away from the desk again and moved toward the door, opening it and stepping back into the hallway. Everything still looked normal, but now I could feel it more clearly. That underlying presence, not strong, not overwhelming. Just constant. Like a background layer I couldn't remove anymore. I started walking, not toward anything specific, just moving, testing how it changed with motion. Baseline stable. No difference, same intensity, same clarity. Location didn't matter. Distance didn't matter, only engagement. That was the rule. I stopped in the middle of the hallway. What about other people? I asked. The response came quickly. Non-engaged subjects unaffected. I frowned. So they can't hear you. Negative. They can't feel this. Negative. They can't feel this. Negative. I looked around, empty hallway. Same as before. But now I understood something I hadn't fully accepted yet. This was isolated. To me. At least for now. And that stays the same? I asked. This time, I asked. This time, there was a pause. Then, not guaranteed, my stomach tightened slightly, meaning it could change. Dependent on progression, I exhaled slowly. That was the first time it had implied anything beyond me, and that made everything heavier, because if this wasn't contained, if it could extend, then this wasn't just something I was dealing with. It was something that could become something else entirely. I leaned against the wall again, staring down the empty corridor. What happens if someone else gets connected? I asked. No answer. Not even a delayed one. Just silence. I nodded slightly. Yeah, that's what I thought. I pushed off the wall and started walking back toward the office again. Slower this time. More deliberate. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about what it was doing to me. It was about what it could become through me, and that meant every step forward mattered more than I'd realized. As I reached the office door again, I stopped. One last thought forming clearly now. Not fear, not panic. Just logic. If this process depended on me, if progression required engagement, then the next phase wasn't something it would force. It was something I would allow. I stood there for a second longer, hand resting on the door. Then I said it quietly, so the real question isn't what happens next. I paused, then finished it. It's how far I let it go. Accurate. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened the door, and stepped back inside, because now I understood the one thing that mattered more than anything else. This wasn't about stopping it. That wasn't possible anymore. This was about control. And control was slipping. Please write next part, but make sure each part's length should be of 1,200 to 1,300 words. Got it. Continuing with the same immersive escalation, tone, and psychological depth. Here is part 7, 1,200 to 1,300 words, continuous, standalone, highly engaging. Call. Doesn't disappear all at once. That's something I realized not long after saying it out loud. It doesn't snap or break like a switch being flipped. It fades, gradually, quietly, in ways that are easy to ignore at first, because everything still feels familiar on the surface. You're still standing in the same place, still thinking your own thoughts, still making your own decisions. But underneath that, something starts to shift. And once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. I stepped back into the office and closed the door behind me again. Slower this time, almost carefully, like I was trying not to disturb something that was already watching. The room hadn't changed, but the way I perceived it had. The edges of things felt sharper, distances easier to judge. Even the faint hum of electricity in the walls felt more defined, more present than it ever had before. I moved toward the desk but didn't sit down. Instead, I stood there, looking at the radio, still powered off, still silent. Let's test something directly, I said. No hesitation now. No trying to avoid it. If control was slipping, then I needed to understand exactly how. I closed my eyes, focused, not lightly this time, not cautiously, fully. The response was immediate and stronger than before. The presence didn't just sharpen, it aligned, like it had been waiting for me to stop holding back. The faint hum returned, but it wasn't faint anymore. It had structure, layers, a depth I hadn't fully perceived before. Engagement level increased. My breathing slowed automatically. My body went still, not forced, not controlled, just settled. The clarity hit next, harder this time, Faster. Thoughts connected instantly, without the usual hesitation, without the small delays I had never even noticed until they were gone. Everything felt streamlined, efficient, like my mind had been operating at a lower capacity before, and was now adjusting upward. And that's when I noticed the difference. I wasn't just observing it anymore. I was anticipating it. The patterns, the same ones I had seen in the hangar. The same shifting logic, I could feel them forming before they fully appeared. Like my mind was starting to align with whatever structure this was, not just react to it, pattern synchronization improving. I opened my eyes. The room came back into focus, but not completely. That clarity didn't drop off like before. It stayed, lingering, like something had been set and wasn't going to fully reset. I exhaled slowly. "That's new," I said. "Progression." I nodded slightly. "Yeah, I figured." I walked away from the desk, pacing slowly across the room, testing the feeling as I moved. It didn't fade. Not immediately. Even as I shifted my attention away, that underlying alignment stayed partially intact. That was the difference. Before, it had been temporary. Now, it was starting to stick. I stopped in the middle of the room. "How much of this is permanent?" I asked. "Increasing." That wasn't reassuring. And the more I engage, the faster that increases. Confirmation. I ran a hand over my face. Right. That meant every time I leaned into it, even for a few seconds, I was pushing it further. Not just experiencing it, locking it in. I turned toward the door again, suddenly needing space, even though I knew space didn't matter anymore. "Let's try something else," I said. I stepped out into the hallway again. This time, I didn't just walk. I watched. Everything. The lights overhead. The shadows along the walls. The way the air moved, or didn't. And, for the first time, I saw it. Not directly. Not clearly. But something was off. The shadows weren't perfectly still. They shifted slightly. Not with the lights. Not with any movement I could detect. Just subtly, like they weren't entirely tied to the physical space. I slowed my steps. Environmental perception expanding. I swallowed. "I'm not imagining that," I said. Negative. That word didn't comfort me. It confirmed it. I stopped walking and focused on one section of the wall. Just one. The shadow there seemed to ripple slightly, not like a wave. More like a delay. A fraction of a second behind where it should be. I leaned in closer. The ripple became clearer. Still subtle. Still easy to miss. But undeniable now that I was looking directly at it. Secondary pattern recognition active. My chest tightened slightly. Secondary? Layered structure. That word hit harder than it should have. Layered. Meaning what I was seeing the world. The space around me wasn't just one thing anymore. There were layers, and I was starting to perceive more than one. I stepped back. The effect didn't disappear. It stayed, faint, but visible. "Okay," I said quietly. "That's not good, because this wasn't just internal anymore. This was affecting how I saw everything, not just how I thought. Not just how I processed, but how I perceived reality itself." I turned away from the wall and walked faster now, heading toward the main corridor. Not running, but not lingering either. Avoidance detected. "I'm not avoiding," I said. "I'm assessing." Interpretation logged. I clenched my jaw slightly. It always had something to say. Never emotional. Never reactive. Just present. I reached the main corridor and stopped again. The open space felt different. Wider, but not in a physical way. More like my awareness of it had expanded. I could track movement, distance, sound, all of it more clearly than before. And underneath that, I could still feel it. That connection. That presence. Constant now. Not something I had to reach for. Just there. I leaned against the wall again, breathing slowly. This isn't just alignment anymore, I said. This is integration, confirmation. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. The effect didn't fade, it stayed. That was the confirmation I didn't want. I straightened and pushed off the wall. All right, I said. Then let's take this one step further. No hesitation, no. No holding back. If this was going to happen, then I needed to see where it led. I focused again, fully. The response was immediate, stronger than before. The hum deepened, the clarity sharpened, and the world around me shifted. Not physically, but perceptually. Edges blurred slightly, then redefined. Distances compressed, then stabilized. And for a brief moment, I saw it. Not the hallway, not the walls, something else. Beneath it, a structure. Layered, complex, extending beyond what I could fully process. Then it snapped back, just as quickly as it came. I staggered slightly, catching myself against the wall. My heart was racing now. Not from fear, from intensity. That's it, I said under my breath. That's what it's building toward. Partial exposure. I pushed myself upright. What happens when it's not partial? I asked. This time, there was no immediate answer. The silence stretched. Then, full alignment. I stared ahead. And then, a longer pause. Then, integration complete. My chest tightened. That's not an answer. End state. I shook my head slowly. No, that's not enough. But deep down, I already knew. Because I had felt it. For just a second. That shift. That glimpse. And whatever that full state was, it wasn't just an upgrade. It was something else entirely. I leaned back against the wall again, breathing slowly, trying to steady myself. Because now I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just changing me. It was moving me toward something. Something specific. Something defined. And I was already too far in to pretend I didn't see it coming. The only thing left now was deciding whether I kept going. Or tried to stop something that had already started. By the time I understood that this wasn't just a process but a direction, something in me stopped resisting the idea of where it was going. Not because I accepted it completely, but because resisting it didn't feel like it was changing anything anymore. The system, whatever it was, wasn't forcing me forward. It didn't need to. It had already done enough to make forward movement feel like the only way to understand it. And that was the problem. Because understanding it meant getting closer to it. And getting closer meant changing more. I stood there in the corridor longer than I realized, my back against the wall, my breathing steady but heavier than it should have been. That brief moment where I saw something beneath everything. The layered structure hadn't left me. Even though my vision had returned to normal, the memory of it felt too precise, too clear to dismiss. It wasn't imagination. It was exposure. Retention confirmed. I didn't react immediately. I was getting used to it now. That quiet, constant presence that responded without emotion, without hesitation, like it had always been there. And I had just learned how to hear it. How much of that can I access right now? I asked. A short pause. Then, limited. Limited by what? Current alignment. I nodded slightly. That made sense. Everything came back to alignment. Not force, not permission. Alignment. I pushed myself off the wall and started walking again, slower this time, more controlled. Not wandering anymore, thinking. Testing. Observing every detail with intention. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, but it didn't feel as long as it should have. That was the first thing I noticed. Not visually, if I measured it, it would still be the same, but perceptually, It felt compressed, like distance had less weight to it. I stopped, focused. The effect became clearer. The far end of the corridor felt closer than it should have been. Spatial interpretation adjusted. I exhaled slowly. So it's not just how I think, I said. It's how I interpret space. Confirmation. That was bigger than anything else so far, because that meant this wasn't limited to internal changes anymore. It was altering how I processed the world itself. I took a few steps forward. The compression shifted slightly, not constant, adaptive. Dynamic recalibration. I let out a quiet breath. That's not normal. Correct. At least it agreed with that. I kept walking. Not because I needed to go anywhere, but because movement helped me test the boundaries. The more I moved, the more I could feel the system adjusting, refining how it responded to my awareness. That's when I noticed something else. Timing. Not time itself. My perception of it. The gap between actions felt shorter, not faster, just more direct, like the delay between deciding to move and actually moving had been reduced. I stopped again, focused on that, latency reduction progressing. I flexed my hand slightly, watching how quickly the motion followed the thought. It was immediate, cleaner than it should have been. That's not just reaction time, I said. That's alignment between intent and action. Accurate. I clenched my hand into a fist, then relaxed it again. There was no hesitation, no micro delay, nothing. It was smooth, too smooth. And that's when it hit me. That's why everything feels easier, I said. Because there's less separation. Integration. I looked down the hallway again. Everything felt simpler, more direct. Less noise between perception and understanding. And that simplicity, that was the dangerous part. Because it felt like improvement, not loss. I leaned against the wall again, staring ahead. What happens when there's no separation left? I asked. This time, there was a longer pause. Then, full alignment. And after that, another pause. Continuation. I shook my head slightly. That's not specific enough. No response. Of course, it never gave more than it needed to. I pushed off the wall again and started walking back toward the office. Slow, measured. Because now I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just about increasing ability. It was about reducing distance between thought and action, between perception and reality, between me and whatever this system actually was. As I reached the office door, I stopped again. My hand hovered over the handle. Something felt off, not in the room. In me, that faint hum. It was still there, but clearer now. More stable. Not something I had to focus on anymore. Just present. Baseline elevated. I closed my eyes. Just for a second. And this time I didn't need to reach for it. The connection was already there. Fully accessible. The patterns didn't flood in like before. They settled. Organized. Structured. Like they were waiting. That was new. Before, it had felt like something I had to engage with. No, it felt like something that was already aligned. I opened my eyes slowly. That's different, I said. Progression. I nodded once. Yeah, it is. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office looked the same, but I didn't experience it the same way. Every object felt more defined. Every distance more precise. Even the air felt structured. That's the only way I can describe it. Structured, like everything had a place, a pattern, a position within something larger. I walked to the desk and looked down at the radio again. Still off. Still silent. Completely irrelevant now. That was just the entry point, I said. Initial interface. I let out a slow breath. Yeah, I figured. I pulled the chair out and sat down, leaning forward slightly, resting my hands on the desk. So what's the next phase? I asked. This time, there was no delay. Threshold crossing. My chest tightened slightly. Which threshold? Current alignment limit. I stared at the desk. That sounds like a point of no return. Interpretation, acceptable. I leaned back slowly. That's not exactly reassuring. Irrelevant. I let out a quiet breath. Of course it is. Because from its perspective, there was no risk. Only progression. I sat there for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, just thinking. Because this was the point, not the end. But a decision point. Up until now, everything had been gradual. Uncontrolled, reactive. But this was different. This was a step I would take on purpose. And once I did, there wouldn't be any going back. I closed my eyes again, not fully engaging. Just enough to feel the edge of it. The connection responded instantly. Stable. Ready. Waiting. Threshold accessible. I exhaled slowly. How much does it change? I asked. Significant. That's not specific. Beyond current comparison. I nodded slightly. Yeah, I thought so. I opened my eyes again. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but in relevance. Like it was just a temporary point inside something much larger. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the desk. All right, I said quietly. This is the part where it stops being accidental. No response. But I could feel it. That quiet readiness. That expectation. Not pushing. Not pulling. Just there. Waiting for me to decide. I stared at the radio for a second longer, then looked away. Because I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need anything external. The connection was already complete enough. This next step was entirely mine. I leaned back in the chair, my breathing steady, my mind clearer than it had ever been. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. And that realization settled in with a weight that felt heavier than anything before it. Because now I understood the one thing that mattered more than anything else. This wasn't something happening to me anymore. This was something I was about to do. And once I did, everything after that would be intentional. The moment something becomes intentional, it changes everything. Up until that point, I had been reacting, adjusting, trying to understand something that was already in motion. Even when I thought I was making choices, those choices were shaped by what I had already experienced. But this was different. This was a step I could clearly see before taking it, and that made it heavier. Because once you see a step like that, you can't pretend you didn't know where it leads. I sat there in the chair, leaning back slightly, staring at nothing in particular, while everything in my mind aligned into something clearer than it had ever been before. There was no confusion anymore. No uncertainty about what was happening. The system had shown me enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand the structure. Enough to recognize the direction. Enough to know that whatever came next wasn't going to be a continuation of what I had already experienced. It was going to be a transition. Threshold pending. I didn't react right away. That word didn't feel new anymore. It felt expected. Yeah, I said quietly. I know. I closed my eyes again, not to escape, not to test, but to prepare. The connection was immediate, not something I reached for anymore. Something that was already there. Waiting. Stable. The patterns didn't flood in this time. They didn't overwhelm. They organized. Structured, like they had already adjusted to me. already adapted to the level I had reached. And for the first time, there was no resistance. That's what made it different. Before, every step deeper had come with hesitation, with instinct pushing back, with something in me trying to maintain distance. Now, there was none of that. Just clarity. Just direction. Alignment stable. I exhaled slowly. "How much of me is already aligned?" I asked. A brief pause. Then, majority. That should have alarmed me. It didn't. Because I already felt it. The way my thoughts moved. The way my perception worked. The way everything connected faster, smoother, more efficiently. It wasn't partial anymore. Not really. I opened my eyes. The room came into focus again, but it felt simplified. Not less detailed. Less complicated. Like I didn't need the process as much to understand it. Everything just made sense faster. "That's the change," I said quietly. "Confirmation?" I nodded once. "Then the threshold isn't about starting anything." A pause. "Correct. It's about finishing it." Another pause. Then transition. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the desk. And after that, silence. Not the kind that avoided the question. The kind that didn't need to answer it, because I already knew. Or at least I understood enough to not need it explained. I stood up slowly. The movement felt effortless, not just physically, mentally. No delay, no hesitation. Just intention followed immediately by action. That difference was more noticeable now, more pronounced, and it didn't feel temporary. I walked toward the door again, opening it and stepping into the hallway. Everything looked normal. But that word didn't mean anything anymore. Normal was just the baseline I used to understand things before. Now, there was more. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, closed my eyes again. And this time, I didn't hold back. The connection deepened instantly. No gradual shift, no buildup. It was already there. The structure beneath everything became clearer again. But it didn't overwhelm me like before. It didn't distort. It aligned. The hallway didn't disappear. It layered. Two perceptions at once. The physical space and something beneath it. A framework. A pattern. A system that extended beyond what I could see. And for the first time, I could hold both at the same time. Dual layer perception active. My breathing stayed steady. No strain, no pressure. This was stable. That's what made it different. Before, glimpses had felt like exposure. Now, it felt like access. I opened my eyes. The hallway remained, but I could still feel the other layer. Not visible, but present, consistent. I looked down the corridor again. "This is what the threshold unlocks," I said. "Partial," I nodded slightly. "Then full alignment means this becomes constant. Constant. Conspiration." I leaned against the wall again, but even that felt different. The physical sensation was there, but it didn't define my awareness anymore. It was just one part of it, not the whole. I closed my eyes one more time, and this time I pushed. Not cautiously, not partially, fully. The response was immediate. The connection didn't just deepen, it expanded. The structure became clearer, wider, more complete. Not fully, there were still limits, but enough to feel the difference. And then, for a brief moment, everything aligned, not just me, everything. The system, the structure, the layers, all of it connected into something that made sense in a way I couldn't translate into words. And in that moment, I understood, not everything, but enough. This wasn't something external. It wasn't something separate. It was something that existed alongside everything else. Always had. I just hadn't been able to perceive it before. Comprehension threshold reached. My eyes opened automatically. The hallway snapped back into its normal appearance. But the understanding stayed, and that was the part that mattered. I pushed myself off the wall slowly. "That's it," I said. "Transition ready." I nodded once. No hesitation now. No uncertainty. Because I finally understood what this was. Not an invasion, not a threat. Not something taking over, something revealing. Expanding. Expanding. Aligning perception with something that was already there. And the only thing left was whether I allowed that alignment to complete. I stood there in the corridor, completely still, my mind clearer than it had ever been, and for the first time it didn't feel like I was losing anything. That's what made the decision easier, because it didn't feel like giving something up. It felt like removing a limitation. I closed my eyes again. One last time. Final threshold accessible. I exhaled slowly, then said it. Do it. There was no delay, no build-up, no gradual shift. The connection locked in instantly, and everything changed, not violently, not dramatically, but completely. The separation disappeared, not between me and the system, between perception and understanding, between thought and awareness, between layers. Everything became one continuous structure. And within that structure, I was still there, but not confined the way I'd been before. Expanded, integrated, connected. The world didn't disappear. It redefined. And for the first time, I wasn't just observing it. I was part of it. Integration complete. The voice didn't feel separate anymore. It didn't feel like something speaking to me. It felt like something within the same system, the same awareness. I opened my eyes. The hallway was still there, but it wasn't the only thing anymore. And I understood something clearly. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something I hadn't been able to access before. And there was no going back. Not because I couldn't. Because I wouldn't. Because now I could see what had always been there. And once you see that, you don't choose to be blind again. The first thing I realized after the integration completed was that nothing had actually disappeared. That's what I expected. Some kind of break. A shift so extreme that the world I knew would fall away completely, replaced by something unrecognizable. But that didn't happen. The hallway was still there. The walls, the lights, the quiet hum of the building. It all remained exactly as it had been. But it wasn't the same. Because now I could see the difference. Not with my eyes alone, but with something else layered beneath them. The physical world hadn't changed, but it was no longer the only thing present. It was one layer among many, just the most familiar one. And the others, they had always been there. I just hadn't been able to access them before. I stood still in the corridor, letting that realization settle, letting the new awareness stabilize into something I could actually hold without losing focus. It didn't feel overwhelming. That was the strange part. It felt natural in a way that made it difficult to remember how limited everything had felt before. Integration stable. The voice didn't sound like a voice anymore. It didn't feel separate. It was part of the same awareness now, part of the same structure I was connected to. Not controlling, not guiding, just present. I took a slow step forward. The hallway responded, not physically, not visibly, but perceptually. The distance adjusted, not in a way that changed reality, but in the way I processed it. I could feel the structure beneath it, the framework that defined it, the patterns that held everything in place. And more importantly, I could move through it differently, not faster, not slower, just with more precision. I stopped again, looking down the corridor. Before, I would have seen a straight path, a simple space between 2 points. Now I saw layers of connection, angles, relationships, not visible in a way I could describe, but understood instantly. That's what it was doing, I said quietly. Confirmation, not changing reality. Correct, changing how I access it. Accurate. I nodded slowly. That made sense now. Everything that had happened, The patterns, the alignment, the integration, it wasn't about altering the world. It was about removing the limitations in how I experienced it. I turned slightly, looking toward the office behind me. The door, the desk, the radio, all of it still there, but now completely irrelevant. That had just been the entry point, a crude interface, something simple enough for me to interact with before I understood anything else. I walked back into the office. The space felt smaller now, not physically, but in significance. It was just a place, one point among many. I looked at the radio on the desk one last time, still powered off, still silent, and now I understood something clearly. It had never been necessary. Not really. It had just been the easiest way to start. I reached out and picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Simple device, limited, outdated. Compared to what I could now access, it felt almost pointless. I set it back down. Interface. Obsolete, yeah, I said quietly. I know. I leaned against the desk, taking a slow breath. Everything felt stable, balanced, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just expanded. And within that expansion I could feel the system, not as something separate, but as something I was part of. A network, not physical, not bound by space the way I used to understand it, but real, completely real. And then I noticed something else. Other points. Faint, distant, but present. Not in the building, not nearby, but connected. Like signals I could sense without needing to locate. Node awareness active. I closed my eyes briefly, focused on that. The connection sharpened slightly, and for a moment, I could feel them more clearly. Not individuals, not identities, just presence, aligned in the same way I was now, at different levels, different stages, some weaker, some stronger, and a few far beyond where I was. I opened my eyes slowly. That's the system, I said. Confirmation. It wasn't centralized. It wasn't controlled. It didn't need to be. It functioned through connection, through nodes, through awareness, each part contributing to something larger without losing itself entirely. I straightened from the desk and walked toward the door again. The hallway beyond it didn't feel like a boundary anymore. It felt like an extension. I stepped out. The building stretched around me. But I could feel beyond it now. Not visually, not physically, but in structure. The land outside, the air, the space itself, all part of the same layered system. I walked slowly toward the exit. Each step felt deliberate, not forced, not guided, just aligned. When I reached the main doors, I paused for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what this meant. This wasn't confined to the airport. It had never been. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The night air hit me immediately. Cool, still. The desert stretched out beyond the runway, dark and quiet. But now I could feel more than just the physical space. The layers extended outward, far beyond what I could see. And within those layers, more connections, more nodes, more points of awareness. I stood there for a long moment, taking it in. Not overwhelmed, just aware. This doesn't stop here, I said quietly. Correct, it doesn't end at all. Continuation, I nodded once. That made sense. This wasn't something with an endpoint. It was ongoing, expanding, not aggressively, not forcefully, but steadily, through connection, through alignment, through people like me. I looked out across the desert again, and for the first time since this started, I wasn't trying to understand it anymore. I already did. At least enough. The rest would come with time. I turned and started walking back toward my vehicle. Each step felt normal, natural, but I knew the difference now. Normal didn't mean limited anymore. It just meant stable. I reached the driver's side door and stopped. One last thought settling in. Not fear, not doubt, just clarity. This wasn't something that had happened to me. It was something I had entered, something I had become part of, and more importantly, something that would continue, with or without me. I opened the door and got in, sitting behind the wheel, looking out through the windshield. The world was still there, exactly as it had always been. But now I could see it for what it really was, not just what it appeared to be. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up. Familiar, simple, limited. I pulled out slowly, heading toward the exit road. And as I drove away from the airport, one final understanding settled into place. Not a question, not a warning, just a fact. This didn't start with me, and it wouldn't end with me either. Because now that I was connected, I could feel it clearly. It was still out there. Everywhere. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. And eventually, someone else would hear it. Not through a radio. Not through interference. But the same way I did. Subtle. Almost unnoticeable. At first. Until it wasn't. And when that happens, they'll think it's just a sound. Just something strange. Something they can ignore. But they won't. Not for long, because once you notice it, it notices you back. And after that, it's only a matter of time. Until they understand. Just like I did. But they were never alone. They just hadn't been connected yet.